The outer walls shuddered under the weight of orbital bombardments, the sky above the fortress burning with the orange glare of Promethean fires and the fractured light of distant suns. Dust and ash fell like snow over the desolate courtyards, coating the shattered remnants of statues and banners once proud with the grime of relentless siege. The gates, massive and scarred with the etchings of centuries, groaned under the pressure of engines and artillery, each tremor carrying through the bones of the fortress like the heartbeat of a dying god. Guardsmen clutched their lost guns, fingers white around triggers, eyes darting across the debris-strewn expanse, while Adeptus Custodes patrolled silently, their golden armor a quiet defiance against the encroaching darkness. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scent of smoke, oil, and iron, a perfume of industry and violence. Servitors moved in their endless, mechanical rhythm, limbs grinding against one another as they carried supplies, munitions, and the occasional wounded soldier through hallways that had once been pristine but now bore the scars of bombardment. The corridors echoed with the low hum of data slates, the sporadic crackle of vox grills transmitting fragmented commands, and the distant thrum of machinery struggling to maintain a semblance of life amidst chaos. Each sound reminded those within that survival was a fleeting luxury, and the fortress, for all its strength, was vulnerable. The first assault had been swift, precise, and unrelenting. Orcs, or perhaps agents of a darker, more insidious force, had tested the outer defenses, hammering at gates with engines of war designed to crush both stone and morale. Reports had been fragmented, voices distorted over the vox, yet all conveyed the same truth: the enemy pressed, and the fortress would not withstand complacency. Soldiers and Scutarii alike moved as if part of a single organism, responding to threats with practiced efficiency, but in the quiet moments between alarms, the weight of fear pressed down. Not fear of death alone, but of failure, of falling short before the Emperor, of allowing these hallowed halls to be desecrated. Refugees huddled in the deeper chambers, families of workers from the manufactorums and adepts who had served generations of governors. Their eyes, wide with terror and fatigue, followed the armored warriors as they passed, whispering prayers to the Emperor in voices that trembled. Some spoke of seeing fragments of light moving through the darkness, rumors of divine favor, perhaps, or merely the hallucinations born of exhaustion, but no one could claim certainty. Every day in the fortress was a test of perception as much as strength, a balancing act between hope and despair. On the upper ramparts, the view was apocalyptic. Burned-out craters marked the landscape where Prometheum refineries once stood, the ground was scarred, rivers of molten metal carving through the ash. Orbital weapons fire still arced through the sky, tracers marking trajectories as if the stars themselves had turned against the fortress. Yet in the midst of this devastation, life endured. Custodians moved with measured grace, their every motion a silent hymn of dedication. Scutarii patrolled corridors with precise, unfeeling attention, ensuring that even the smallest breach was met with lethal efficiency. And the soldiers, mere humans, frail and mortal, pressed forward, their resolve a stubborn glow against the encroaching shadow. In this crucible, alliances formed, some unspoken, some forged under fire. A guardsman might hand a ration to a trembling adept, or a Scutarii might offer mechanical assistance to a wounded comrade, each gesture a fragile thread in the tapestry of survival. But there was no room for sentimentality, every act carried consequence, and the fortress tolerated neither weakness nor hesitation. Each footstep through shattered halls was a gamble, each glance into the darkness a silent calculation of risk. And through it all, the gates remained, the gates of perdition, as some whispered in fearful awe, an unyielding barrier against the chaos beyond. They were scarred, battered, and trembling, yet they held. For now. The corridors beneath the gates were a labyrinth of stone and steel, each turn revealing both scars of battle and echoes of lives lived within the fortress. Servitors glided through the halls with the soft, grinding whir of their cogitators, their heads swinging on servomotors as they carried rations, munitions, and the occasional injured soldier. Shadows flickered across walls etched with bas-reliefs of past victories and sacred battles, now partially obscured by smoke and dust. In the flickering light of failing lumens, the carvings seemed almost alive, the heroic figures frozen mid-stride, watching silently as the fortress endured its latest trial. Soldiers moved in pairs and small squads, their lost guns held at the ready. Their boots echoed against the stone floors, a hollow rhythm that underscored the tension pressing down upon every inhabitant. The air was heavy, laden with heat, exhaust, and the faint tang of antiseptic as medics tended to wounds both physical and unseen. Each corridor seemed longer than the last, each corner a potential death trap, yet life persisted, an insistence born not of hope alone, but of duty, of obedience to a command that transcended personal fear. Above, the siege continued in relentless waves. Explosions shook the walls, distant enough to be muffled but close enough to rattle nerves. The enemy's intent was clear: attrition, pressure, and eventual submission. Reports came intermittently through the Vox grill, fragmented by static and interference, recounting the destruction of outer fortifications and the relentless push of mechanized armor across the courtyard. The fortress trembled beneath the weight of these attacks, but its inhabitants responded with the precision of those who had trained for centuries. Custodians and Scutarii moved like shadows, cutting through corridors, sealing breaches, and extinguishing fires before they could spread, each action a silent ode to their unyielding vigilance. In a dimly lit chamber near the central manufactorum, a group of adepts huddled around a flickering data slate, analyzing damage reports and supply levels. Their faces, pale from exhaustion and worry, betrayed a flicker of fear whenever a distant explosion shook the room. Yet they worked with meticulous care, their fingers tracing schematics, rerouting power to critical systems, ensuring that Promethium flowed where it was needed and that the gates remained reinforced. One whispered a prayer, barely audible over the hum of machinery, a plea to the Emperor for guidance, for protection, for some small mercy in a world that had none to offer. Outside, the courtyard was a tableau of chaos. Craters pocked the ground where artillery shells had struck, pools of molten promethium glimmered like malevolent stars, and the cries of soldiers rose above the roar of war engines. Even here, human resilience manifested in quiet acts of defiance, a guardsman lifting a fallen comrade from the rubble, a Scutarii repairing a breached wall panel while bullets ricocheted overhead, a custodian standing motionless as the sky burned with fire, a golden sentinel against an unfeeling universe. Life and death intertwined, each action shaping the unfolding narrative of endurance and despair. Yet the fortress was not merely a place of stone and steel, it was a living entity, a crucible of history, memory, and will. Its halls bore the impressions of centuries of service, its walls soaked in sweat, blood, and devotion. Even as the enemy pressed closer, even as smoke and flame threatened to engulf everything, there was a rhythm to survival, a cadence to the steps, a faint pulse beneath the chaos that whispered of continuance. Every footstep, every decision, every measured breath carried weight, and each person within the fortress, soldier, adept, or servitor, became part of that pulse, bound together by duty and circumstance. And above it all, the gates of perdition remained. They groaned under the pressure, but they did not break. They held against the onslaught of a universe determined to claim them, a testament not only to stone and steel, but to the indomitable will of those who defended them. Outside, the shadows lengthened as day gave way to night, the horizon a burning smear of orange and crimson, yet the fortress endured, a solitary beacon of resistance amid the apocalypse. The night brought no relief. The sky above the fortress was an oppressive canvas of smoke, ash, and distant fire, illuminated intermittently by the jagged streaks of enemy bombardments. The ramparts shivered with every impact, and even the most seasoned veterans felt the tremor of dread crawl along their spines. In these hours, the distinction between soldier and civilian blurred, everyone became a participant in a theater of survival, each breath heavy with anticipation, each heartbeat a measure of defiance. Inside the inner halls, the ambient hum of machinery was punctuated by sudden alarms, echoing off walls adorned with imperial aquilas and sanctified reliefs. Servitors adjusted conduits and valves, ensuring the manufactorums continued to produce promethium and munitions without pause, their mechanical obedience a stark contrast to the fragile, unpredictable human lives around them. Adepts moved between chambers with swift precision, recording damages, rerouting power, and ensuring communication lines remained intact. Even in exhaustion, every action was imbued with a sense of ritual, failure was inconceivable, and yet the shadow of possibility hovered like a storm cloud. Along the central corridor, a group of guardsmen pressed forward cautiously, their lost guns ready, scanning every alcove and archway for signs of infiltration. The distant cries of comrades, some wounded, some fallen, reverberated through the corridors, punctuating the rhythmic hum of life and machinery with stark reminders of mortality. The air smelled of burnt oil and scorched stone, thick and acrid, clinging to uniforms and hair alike. Yet amidst this oppressive atmosphere, there was clarity, a brutal, undeniable sense that the fortress would endure because those within it refused to falter. Above, the custodians maintained their silent vigil. Golden armor glinting even in dim emergency lumens, they stood as immovable as the walls themselves, scanning the horizon with measured grace. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture calculated, an embodiment of centuries of devotion and the unbroken will of the Emperor's guardians. Their presence lent both hope and terror to those around them, hope, that the fortress had champions capable of withstanding the enemy's might, and terror, that failure, even for a single human, would not go unnoticed. The refugees, too, had begun to adapt, finding niches and alcoves in the shadowed corridors, sharing whispered prayers and stories to keep despair at bay. They spoke of fragments of light glimpsed through fissures in the stone, rumors of miracles or omens, perhaps even glimpses of the Astronomicon itself. No one could claim certainty, every sighting was fragmented, subjective, and ephemeral. Yet even the faintest glimmer of belief provided solace, a fragile tether to the world beyond the gates, a reminder that life, even in the fortress's suffocating shadow, was not yet extinguished. As hours bled into each other, the fortress settled into a tense rhythm. Patrols cycled through corridors, alarms sounded at irregular intervals, and the distant roar of siege engines became a haunting lullaby. In these moments, every inhabitant felt the weight of their own mortality pressing alongside the collective responsibility of survival. Each corridor, each stairwell, each shadowed chamber was a stage upon which fear and courage danced in equal measure. And still, the gates of perdition held. Outside, the enemy massed, relentless in their pursuit, yet within the fortress, a fragile order persisted. The survivors clung to routines, prayers, and the unspoken bond forged in shared adversity. Every clang of a dropped tool, every whispered command, every measured footstep was an affirmation, life would persist, walls would stand, and even amidst annihilation, the fortress remained a sanctuary of resistance. As dawn threatened the horizon, the first faint light barely piercing the smoke, the inhabitants of the gates of perdition understood something profound yet unspoken. The battle was far from over, but the fortress had survived this night. It had survived the first wave of fire and fury. And in surviving, it had forged a story of resilience, of courage, and of human, and mechanized, endurance that would echo long after the walls themselves had crumbled. The first chapter of survival was written in stone, steel, and blood, but the story of what lay beneath, within, and beyond the gates of perdition had only just begun. Beneath the ramparts and shattered courtyards, the fortress became a labyrinth of shadow and whisper. The deeper halls were seldom traversed by anyone beyond adepts and maintenance servitors, yet now they teemed with movement, a silent tide of survival pressing through corridors carved from centuries of devotion and war. Stone walls bore the scars of previous sieges, etched with cracks and burn marks, yet they hummed with latent power, electromagnetic currents and the residual resonance of ancient wards that had once repelled invaders. Every echo was magnified, every footstep amplified, and the soft whir of servitors carried through the passageways like the pulse of the fortress itself. In these hidden chambers, rumor and reality entwined. Adepts whispered of strange lights reflected in polished armor, of fleeting shapes glimpsed at the edge of vision, and of voices that seemed to emanate not from the hallways, but from within their own minds. Some called them fragments of the Emperor's vigilance, others feared they were harbingers of the warp. No one could say for certain. Yet the stories persisted, passing quietly from one survivor to another, muttered with reverence or dread, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention from whatever forces lingered unseen. The air was colder here, stagnant with the scent of stone and ancient machinery. Pipes lined the walls, carrying steam and coolant with a hiss that resembled the sigh of a sleeping colossus. Flickering lumens cast shadows that seemed to twist and elongate, giving the impression of movement where there was none. Soldiers navigated these passages with cautious precision, lost guns at the ready, scanning alcoves and archways for signs of infiltration or collapse. Each step felt measured, almost ceremonial, as if the act of walking through the fortress itself was a ritual of survival. Even the servitors seemed aware of the oppressive tension. Their mechanical eyes glowed faintly, illuminating corridors in pools of cold light, while their articulated limbs moved with relentless purpose. They carried supplies, tended machinery, and in some cases assisted the wounded, their tireless presence a reminder that even amid fear, the fortress had systems that endured beyond human frailty. Their mechanical monotony was both comforting and uncanny, a counterpoint to the anxiety etched into every living face. In a long-abandoned reliquary, the walls lined with icons and relics, a small contingent of guardsmen paused, reverent and wary. Dust coated every surface, yet the objects here seemed to shimmer faintly, as if memory itself had imbued them with a subtle resonance. One soldier touched a carved bas-relief of a long-forgotten battle, tracing the worn lines with fingers trembling from both fatigue and awe. The story of the fortress was written in such places, every scar, every faded glyph, a fragment of history, a reminder of the countless lives expended in its defense. Voices carried from distant chambers, fragments of conversation, prayer, and occasional argument, mingled with the rhythmic hum of machinery. The astronomican's faint pulse, barely perceptible, was felt as much as heard, a tenuous thread linking these hidden halls to the broader galaxy. Even far below the ramparts, the fortress remained a conduit between worlds, bridging the human and the mechanical, the mortal and the eternal. And yet, amidst this intricate web of life and purpose, fear remained. Fear of collapse, fear of the enemy's encroachment, and fear of what lurked beyond the veil of perception. Here, survival was as much a test of the mind as the body. Shadows became portals to imagined horrors, every flicker of light a possible harbinger of death, and the whisper of wind through cracked conduits carried secrets that may or may not be real. Adepts recorded anomalies with meticulous precision, annotating them as possible warp interference or sensor misalignment, though even they could not dismiss the possibility that the strange phenomena were neither mechanical nor imagined. Soldiers moved in tandem, relying on training and instinct, but instinct alone could not account for the unease that settled into bones and minds alike. And yet, amidst all the tension, there was awe. The fortress's hidden chambers, relics of 1,000 generations, whispered of endurance and devotion. Even as the shadows stretched and warped, even as the distant explosions rattled foundations, the inner halls held a quiet majesty, an affirmation that life, in its most stubborn form, could persist even beneath the weight of annihilation. Here, in the depths, the story of the fortress expanded beyond survival, hinting at mysteries yet to unfold, whispers yet to be understood, and truths that might never fully reveal themselves. The deeper corridors seemed almost alive, responding to each footstep with echoes that stretched unnaturally, warping sound and perception alike. Adepts moved with quiet precision, their robes brushing against stone walls etched with inscriptions so old that even their meaning had become uncertain. Some were prayers, some warnings, others fragments of engineering notes long since obsolete, but all carried a weight that pressed upon the mind. Soldiers and Scutarii alike tread carefully, aware that a misstep could trigger not just physical collapse, but the fragile equilibrium of morale that held the fortress together. In one chamber, a small group of guardsmen paused before a sealed vault, its iron-bound doors pitted with corrosion and scorched from previous bombardments. Whispers had long surrounded the room, tales of a forgotten reliquary, of fragments of ancient artifacts, and of visions granted to those who lingered too long. No one dared enter unbidden, superstition intertwined with canon, and every rumor was a thread connecting the present to centuries of precedent. The vault hummed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if responding to the collective tension in the room. The soldiers exchanged silent glances, knowing that some truths, even within a fortress dedicated to survival, were best approached with caution. Elsewhere, the manufactorums continued their tireless labor. The rhythmic pounding of pistons, the hiss of steam, and the glare of forges illuminated the deeper halls in a hellish light. Skitarii moved among the machinery with methodical efficiency, ensuring that production never ceased, even as structural tremors shook the walls. Every cog, every conduit, every line of energy maintained a delicate balance. Failure in one segment could ripple outward, creating chaos in a network designed to sustain life and war in equal measure. Guardsmen moved alongside, eyes scanning for signs of structural failure or enemy infiltration, their breaths shallow, their senses taut. Rumors from the upper halls filtered downward, carried by messengers and comms lines alike. Some spoke of strange figures glimpsed at the edge of sight, cloaked in darkness yet moving with unnatural grace. Others whispered of distant lights dancing in unoccupied chambers, of murmurs that did not belong to any human voice. The adepts catalogued these reports meticulously, annotating them as possible warp interference or sensor anomalies, yet even the most rational minds could not entirely dismiss the possibility that the fortress itself had become a conduit to something beyond mortal understanding. Shadows were no longer simple absences of light, they were layers of perception, rumor, and instinct intertwined, shaping the thoughts of those who moved through them. In one narrow hall, a lone guardsman traced the edges of carved reliefs with his fingertips, marveling at the craftsmanship of an age-long past. The figures depicted in battle, frozen mid-stride, seemed to stir as he passed, shadows lengthening in ways that defied the light sources. He paused, inhaling the sharp tang of ozone and scorched metal, and whispered a quiet prayer to the Emperor. The fortress, for all its ancient grandeur and resilience, demanded recognition, respect, and vigilance. Every surface, every corridor, was a testament to those who had endured before, a reminder that the present struggle was merely one chapter in an unbroken chain of perseverance. The deeper chambers also carried the weight of loss. Abandoned armories, shattered barracks, and empty medical wards told a silent story of sacrifice, of lives spent defending a citadel that could never truly rest. In these spaces, shadows seemed thicker, almost tangible, pressing against walls as if mourning alongside the living. The few who lingered here felt a mixture of awe and dread, their senses heightened by the knowledge that they were walking paths once trodden by the fallen. Each step was both homage and necessity. Survival demanded movement, but memory demanded acknowledgement. And yet, even in darkness, the fortress breathed with life. Servitors continued their ceaseless labor, mechanized footsteps echoing in rhythm with human ones. Adepts recorded and analyzed, their minds straining to understand anomalies, yet always framed within canon-safe context. Soldiers maintained watch, their lost guns steady, eyes scanning for any hint of threat. Every individual, every machine, every whispered prayer was a note in a complex symphony of endurance. The inner halls, though hidden and shadowed, had become a crucible of awareness, a place where fear, reverence, and duty interwove into something greater than survival alone. Through the labyrinthine corridors, the pulse of the Astronomicon could still be felt, a distant from connecting this isolated citadel to the sprawling Imperium beyond. It was a faint, fragile thread, but it was enough to remind the inhabitants that they were part of a vast, unyielding galaxy. Shadows and whispers might obscure truth, but the fortress, in all its labyrinthine complexity, held steadfast. And those within it would continue to endure, walking its darkened halls with courage, vigilance, and a lingering sense of awe at the mysteries that surrounded them. The halls deep within the fortress had a rhythm all their own. Pipes pulsed with steam, their hissing breath a mechanical whisper that echoed against walls scarred with age and battle. Even the stone seemed alive, resonating faintly with the energy coursing through the manufactorums above and the distant pulse of the Astronomicon, a constant reminder that this fortress, though hidden, was part of something greater. Every footstep, every whispered word, every metallic grind of servitor limbs contributed to an intricate symphony of survival, a tapestry woven from the fragile threads of human and machine alike. In a secluded chamber, adepts huddled over a network of data slates, tracking subtle anomalies and disturbances. Faint, irregular surges in the energy conduits hinted at forces beyond comprehension, though whether they were the result of warp interference, mechanical failure, or simple superstition was impossible to determine. They marked each event carefully, annotating with precise language, yet their eyes betrayed a shared unease. Even in their rationality, they could not entirely deny the whispers that brushed against the edges of their perception, nor the fleeting sense that some presence, unseen, unknowable, moved alongside them in the shadows. Soldiers patrolling the inner corridors felt it too. A subtle chill that did not belong to the climate control systems. A whisper at the edge of hearing, lost as soon as one tried to locate its source. Their training kept them moving, weapons raised and senses sharp, but instinct refused to be fully suppressed. The deeper they ventured, the more the fortress seemed to expand beyond its physical walls, corridors twisting subtly, stairwells descending into darkness that defied architectural logic. Rumors circulated quietly among the ranks, visions of long-dead custodians, fleeting glimpses of primarchs walking unseen, and the faint glimmer of something impossibly ancient in the flickering shadows. Yet life persisted, stubborn and unyielding. Servitors moved with quiet efficiency, transporting supplies, tending to machinery, and carrying the wounded from chamber to chamber. Scitarii patrolled with methodical precision, eyes glowing faintly as they scanned for anomalies, breaches, or signs of infiltration. Guardsmen, though weary and anxious, pressed forward with disciplined resolve, understanding that even the smallest lapse could lead to catastrophe. The fortress demanded vigilance, it would tolerate neither negligence nor hesitation. Among the shadows, fragments of memory and rumor intertwined. A lone soldier paused before a faded mural depicting a battle long past, tracing the carved lines with fingers trembling from fatigue and awe. The figures seemed almost alive in the dim light, the clash of bronze and steel etched into stone reverberating with the echoes of centuries. He whispered a quiet prayer to the emperor, feeling the weight of all who had fallen in defense of this fortress. Every scar, every dent in the walls, every shard of fractured bas-relief carried the story of perseverance against overwhelming odds. In the quiet spaces between patrols and production, the fortress spoke to those who would listen. The faint pulse of the Astronomicon threaded through the hidden halls, reminding all that they were connected to the galaxy at large, a distant but unbroken lifeline. Shadows, whispers, and flickering lights wove a tapestry of uncertainty and awe, blurring the line between perception and reality. Each moment of fear was counterbalanced by resilience, each fleeting glimpse of the unknown tempered by duty. The inhabitants of the fortress existed in a delicate balance, suspended between survival and the mysteries that surrounded them. And yet, despite the darkness, there was purpose. Every step taken through the hidden halls, every whispered prayer, every mechanical hum was part of a greater story, a story of endurance, of devotion, of courage in the face of incomprehensible odds. The fortress had survived bombardments, assaults, and the uncertainty of shadowed corridors. It had endured because those within it refused to falter, because even in fear, they moved with deliberate care, bound together by duty and the unspoken acknowledgement of shared struggle. As the first faint light of day filtered through fissures in the outer walls, the inner chambers seemed to exhale. The fortress, alive in its own right, continued to hum with the persistent rhythm of life, labor, and vigilance. The echoes in the dark had been catalogued, observed, and respected. They were no longer merely the whisper of fear, but the pulse of a citadel that had faced the unknown and remained unbroken. The gates of perdition had endured, and now the inner labyrinth had revealed its own stories, its own trials, and its own mysteries. Survival was no longer only about the outer walls, it had become a journey through the fortress itself, a descent into the hidden and often terrifying truths of life under siege. And yet, even as the shadows receded with the coming light, the fortress offered no promises, only the assurance that its halls, for all their danger, had preserved those within for the battles yet to come. The manufactorums roared like hellscapes beneath the fortress, a constant symphony of industry and survival. Pistons slammed with relentless force, sparks leaped from grinding gears, and the glow of molten promethium illuminated corridors that seemed almost alive with heat. Scitarii moved among the machinery with measured precision, their mechanical limbs articulating flawlessly as they guided war gear, ammunition, and supplies to every corner of the fortress. The air was thick with ozone, soot, and the acrid tang of burning oil, a scent that clung to clothing, hair, and lungs, a reminder that life here was measured in labor, fire, and endurance. Above the din, the distant rumble of bombardments punctuated the industrial cadence. Each explosion shook the floors, rattled the conduits, and sent vibrations through the steel-reinforced walls. Yet the manufactorums persisted, a testament to the impervious rhythm of human and machine alike. Guardsmen patrolled the outer corridors, lost guns raised, scanning for breaches, while custodians stood sentinel over critical areas, golden eyes reflecting the furnace glow with stoic vigilance. Even in the chaos, every individual understood their role, every cog, every breath, every measured step contributed to the fragile balance that kept the fortress alive. In the heart of the forge halls, a group of adepts monitored energy conduits and production lines, adjusting valves, redirecting power, and ensuring the manufactorums did not falter. Sweat ran down their brows, mingling with the soot and grime that covered their robes. The machinery demanded obedience, and failure meant not just wasted effort, but potentially catastrophic consequences for the fortress itself. Sparks flew as molten metal was poured into molds, forming the components of war engines and Prometheum cartridges that would sustain the defenders through the siege. Each strike of a hammer, each hiss of steam, was both a song of survival and a declaration of defiance. Among the workers, whispers of rumor circulated quietly. Some spoke of fragments of the Emperor's presence felt within the furnaces, of visions glimpsed in the reflection of molten metal. Others murmured tales of previous sieges, of heroes and martyrs who had walked these halls long before, leaving their mark in the scorch of stone and steel. The stories were as much part of the forge as the machinery itself, lending a sense of purpose and continuity to labor that might otherwise have seemed endless and meaningless. The air shimmered with heat and anticipation, blending physical exertion with spiritual resonance in a way that was uniquely the fortress's own. Outside the immediate manufactorum, the auxiliary corridors were a labyrinth of conduits, pipelines, and storage chambers. Servitors labored tirelessly, transporting heavy supplies and munitions, their mechanical limbs moving with unerring efficiency. Occasionally, a sudden tremor would ripple through the walls, the distant impact of enemy fire reverberating like a pulse, yet even these shocks were absorbed into the rhythm of labor. Scitarii adjusted with mechanical precision, their enhanced senses detecting structural stress before it could manifest, their movements a bridge between human vigilance and machine-like inevitability. In a smaller chamber off the main forge floor, a squad of guardsmen paused to check the integrity of emergency containment systems. Prometheum leaks were a constant danger, and even a minor rupture could ignite catastrophic fires. Sweat dripped down helmets, and every measured motion carried the weight of both duty and survival. The room was filled with the acrid stench of scorched stone and the sharp tang of heated metal, and the men moved with synchronized precision born of both training and desperation. Each small success, each avoided accident, reinforced a fragile sense of control in a fortress otherwise dominated by chaos and threat. Above them, the custodians continued their silent vigil, moving with a grace that belied the immense weight of their armor. Their presence was both comforting and terrifying, comforting because they were the Emperor's undoubted champions, terrifying because their judgment, though silent, was absolute. Even in the constant roar of furnaces and machinery, their eyes seemed to pierce the smoke and shadows, a reminder that discipline and honor persisted even amid destruction. The fires of the forge did more than sustain life, they defined it. Every spark, every hiss, every clanging strike was a heartbeat, a pulse that connected human and machine, past and present, survival and sacrifice. In this furnace, the fortress endured not merely because of walls or weapons, but because of the people and constructs who made it their duty to stand, to work, and to survive. Even as the first part of the night drew to a close, the manufactorums had not faltered. Their rhythm continued, unwavering, a defiant song of metal and flame against the darkness that pressed in from every horizon. And within that song, the fortress itself seemed to hum with life, a quiet reminder that survival was not just about holding the walls, but sustaining the very heart of the place that held them all. The deeper furnaces glowed like molten suns, casting elongated shadows across the walls of the manufactorums. Steam hissed from pressure valves, mingling with the sharp tang of heated metal and the acrid odor of promethium. Scitarii patrolled these inner chambers with mechanical precision, their enhanced senses detecting the subtlest fluctuation in temperature, vibration, or energy output. Each movement was deliberate, a bridge between instinct and programming, ensuring that the relentless labor of the forge continued uninterrupted even as the enemy's bombardments rattled the outer walls. Among the human workers, fatigue pressed heavily upon every muscle. Guardsmen and adepts alike moved with a mechanical rhythm, their bodies pushed to extremes by necessity. Sweat mingled with soot, grime streaked their faces, and blisters ran unchecked across hands calloused by endless toil. Yet, even as exhaustion threatened to break resolve, there was a shared understanding that the machinery and the fortress depended upon them. Every cartridge forged, every piece of war gear polished, every beam of reinforced steel measured and secured was a lifeline for the fortress and its inhabitants. Failure here would ripple outward, threatening lives across the citadel. In one particularly vast chamber, a team of adepts monitored the flow of promethium to critical energy conduits, adjusting valves with precision that bordered on artistry. Sparks flew as molten fuel passed through conduits, casting their faces in fleeting, golden light. One adept muttered a quiet prayer, invoking the Emperor's protection for the flames and the lives dependent upon them. A nearby guardsman glanced over, eyes reflecting both exhaustion and reverence, acknowledging the ritualistic cadence of labor that had become inseparable from survival itself. In these halls, work was devotion, and devotion was survival. The distant roar of siege engines reverberated through the fortress, but inside the manufactorums, the noise became a percussion alongside the clanging pistons and grinding gears. Every vibration reminded the workers that the fortress was alive, a massive organism sustained by energy, effort, and sheer will. Custodians moved silently through the halls, their golden armor reflecting the firelight, ever watchful, ever vigilant. Their presence was a stabilizing force, a constant in a realm otherwise dominated by chaos and uncertainty. Even the faintest sound of an alarm drew attention, each pair of eyes scanning corridors and machinery for the source of disturbance. In the storage chambers branching from the main forge floor, supplies were organized with meticulous precision. Boxes of munitions, crates of promethium, and armaments lined the walls, each labeled, inventoried, and maintained. Servitors carried these loads with tireless efficiency, following programmed routines with unerring accuracy. A single misstep, a misrouted crate, a momentary lapse in attention, could result in catastrophic delays or hazards, yet the fortress absorbed such minor imperfections, allowing survival to continue through discipline and redundancy. Even as the night deepened, the manufactorum seemed to hum with life, a steady pulse of metal and flame that contrasted the uncertainty beyond the walls. Soldiers shared fleeting glances of camaraderie amidst the labor, understanding that survival here was as much about shared endurance as individual heroism. Stories of previous sieges, fragments of rumor and legend, circulated quietly, tales of custodians who had held the lines against impossible odds, of adepts whose rituals had saved entire halls, of guardsmen who had sacrificed themselves to prevent catastrophe. These stories, half-truths and fully imagined alike, became part of the heartbeat of the forge, weaving morale into the rhythm of labor. Above the furnaces, the glow from vents and chimneys cast dancing patterns across the ceilings, a transient light show of orange, gold, and crimson. Shadows twisted and merged with smoke, giving the impression of movement where there was none, and inspiring both awe and unease. Some whispered that the Emperor's gaze lingered in these flames, that fragments of divine vigilance watched over those who labored, guiding them through danger unseen. Whether truth or superstition, the notion lent purpose to each step, each motion, each measured breath in the oppressive heat. And through it all, the fortress endured. The manufactorums, as much heart as workshop, maintained the lifeblood of the citadel. Every spark, every hiss of steam, every measured swing of hammer or adjustment of valve was a testament to resilience, devotion, and the unbroken will of the Emperor's servants. Outside, the war raged on, but within these halls, life persisted, fragile, tenacious, and resolutely human, yet inseparably intertwined with the mechanical, the ritual, and the divine. The fires of the forge did not merely consume, they illuminated, they defined, and they sustained. And as the first part of the night yielded to the second, every individual within those halls understood that their labor, their vigilance, and their sacrifice were the pulse that kept the fortress alive, standing against a universe intent on its destruction. The heart of the manufactorums pulsed with relentless energy, a furnace of survival that refused to acknowledge exhaustion or despair. Sparks leapt from molten metal as it poured into molds, illuminating the faces of guardsmen, adepts, and Scutarii alike, each reflecting determination, fatigue, and unspoken reverence. The rhythm of labor became almost hypnotic, a dance of fire, steel, and duty. Every hammer strike, every hiss of steam, every turn of a valve was both mechanical necessity and quiet act of devotion. In these halls, life itself was forged in fire. Amid the chaos, a squad of guardsmen moved through a narrow passage leading to the auxiliary chambers. Their lost guns were ready, but their eyes were drawn to the intricate lattice of machinery, conduits, and vents. Each corridor held potential danger, structural weakness, enemy infiltration, or simple mechanical failure, but the soldiers pressed forward with the practiced precision of those who had trained for years, their minds balancing fear with necessity. Every measured step reinforced the fragile equilibrium that sustained the fortress, each act of vigilance a bulwark against the tide of destruction pressing ever closer. In the inner sanctum of the forge, a pair of adepts monitored energy levels for the production lines. The readings fluctuated as bursts of energy surged through conduits, sparks flying unpredictably. One adept murmured a prayer, invoking the Emperor's guidance over the machinery and those who tended it. The other adjusted a control valve with a practiced hand, ensuring that Prometheum continued its relentless flow to the outer defenses. These small, precise motions, unnoticed by most, were as critical to survival as the firing lines above. A single miscalculation here could ripple outward, jeopardizing every life that depended on the manufactorum's unbroken rhythm. The roar of distant bombardment was a constant reminder of the siege's persistence. The outer walls shuddered under the force of artillery, yet the manufactorums absorbed and redistributed energy, a silent testament to engineering and devotion working in concert. Servitors carried crates of ammunition and equipment along corridors lined with soot and scorched metal, moving with tireless efficiency, their mechanical limbs unerringly precise. Scutarii adjusted panels and monitored structural integrity, their sensors detecting vibrations invisible to human senses, ensuring that the fortress's beating heart, the forge, remained unbroken. Outside the manufactorums, the custodians maintained their vigilance. Golden armor glinting in the furnace glow, they moved through hallways with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Their eyes scanned constantly, noting every vibration, every shadow, every deviation from the expected. Even amidst the heat, the noise, and the relentless labor, they were a living reminder that the fortress was more than stone and steel, it was defended, watched over, and sanctified by the Emperor's chosen. Their presence lent both reassurance and quiet terror, a stabilizing constant in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. In quieter alcoves, soldiers and adepts shared brief moments of reflection. A whispered prayer here, a silent nod there, small gestures that wove morale and camaraderie into the fabric of survival. Stories of previous sieges, legendary acts of sacrifice, and whispered accounts of custodian heroics circulated, reinforcing the sense of purpose that drove every individual forward. Even amidst fire, metal, and relentless labor, the human heart endured, its resilience mirrored in the unyielding rhythm of the manufactorums. As the night pressed on, the fires of the forge continued their work, illuminating halls thick with soot and sweat. Shadows danced along walls scarred by centuries of siege, merging past and present in fleeting reflections of bravery and horror. Every spark, every hiss, every measured strike of hammer or adjustment of valve carried weight far beyond the physical, it was devotion, survival, and witness to the ongoing struggle of the fortress. And as the first pale light of dawn touched the edges of the outer walls, the manufactorums exhaled, a furnace that had sustained life through the darkness. The fortress remained standing, its beating heart intact, its labor uninterrupted. Survival here was not merely about resistance, it was about sustaining the very essence of the citadel. The fires of the forge had forged not just weapons, not just supplies, but the indomitable spirit of those who endured. The first half of the siege had been survived. The outer walls held, the inner labyrinth remained a place of whispers and shadows, and the fires of the forge ensured that every defender, every servitor, and every spirit within the fortress had the tools, the will, and the strength to face the battles yet to come. And beyond the glow of the forges, in shadowed corridors and hidden chambers, the story of the siege was only beginning to deepen, foreshadowing trials of perception, rumor, and metaphysical uncertainty yet to unfold. The deeper corridors of the fortress held more than stone, steel, and machinery. Here, in the shadowed passages far from the bombardments above, reality seemed to ripple, subtle and insidious. Whispers threaded through the air like half-formed thoughts, audible only at the edges of perception. Guardsmen swore they heard voices in empty hallways, while adepts recorded fleeting glimpses of shapes that vanished when confronted directly. Some claimed the fortress itself was awake, a conscious entity reacting to the siege, while others feared the warp's tendrils had begun to creep into these hallowed halls. The air smelled different here, metallic, sweet, almost electric, carrying a faint undercurrent of ozone. Even the servitors, precise and unfeeling, seemed to hesitate as their mechanical eyes scanned hallways illuminated by flickering lumens. Shadows shifted in impossible ways, elongating or converging where no architecture existed to support them. Soldiers gripped their lost guns tighter, senses straining to discern friend from phantom. Every step felt like a negotiation between the corporeal and the unseen, each breath a delicate balance between duty and fear. In a secluded chamber lined with reliquaries and faded murals, an adept paused before a carved image of a long-lost primarch. His fingers traced the grooves, noting the flicker of light along the edges, and whispered a prayer. The images seemed to respond, subtly shifting in the dim glow, though no observer could confirm whether it was a trick of light, fatigue, or something else entirely. Nearby, another adept shivered, claiming to feel a presence just beyond perception, an awareness that was neither hostile nor comforting, but impossibly vast. These were not hallucinations alone, every observer felt the same disquiet, each adding to the tension that threaded the hidden corridors like an electric current. Some soldiers reported that the whispers carried meaning, fragments of warnings or instructions, though the words were always fleeting, incomplete, and contradictory. "Seal, fire, beware," one murmured aloud, only to shake his head and wonder if the voice had been real. In the deeper chambers, memory and rumor merged with reality, and those who lingered too long risked losing the distinction entirely. Adepts recorded these events meticulously, annotating each with disclaimers: possible warp interference, subjective perception, unverified observation. Yet the very act of recording seemed insufficient, as if documentation alone could not anchor the mind against the subtle erosion of certainty. Skitarii patrolled alongside soldiers, their mechanical senses detecting anomalies imperceptible to human perception. Energy readings spiked without apparent cause, conduits hummed in frequencies that should not exist. Even the custodians, unwavering and imposing, moved with a heightened alertness, scanning corners and alcoves that should have remained mundane. Their vigilance was a counterpoint to the unseen currents threading the fortress, a reminder that while fear and rumor might exist, disciplined observation and preparedness could still anchor reality. Despite the unease, life persisted. The manufactorums continued to burn with fire, servitors labored tirelessly, and soldiers carried out patrols with grim determination. The warp, if it stirred here, had not yet overwhelmed the citadel. Yet in quieter moments, the fortress seemed to breathe differently, slower, heavier, as if aware that unseen eyes watched every motion, every decision. Whispers lingered in the corners of perception, and those who acknowledged them too loudly risked drawing attention from something beyond comprehension. Even the architecture itself seemed complicit. Corridors twisted subtly, stairways descended farther than the map suggested, and some doors opened to hallways that had no logical counterpart elsewhere. Adepts speculated about ancient wards embedded in the stone, designed to obscure the innermost sanctums of the fortress from both intruder and inquisitive mind alike. Yet the warp's influence was patient, creeping along fissures in reality, leaving fragments of doubt, flashes of insight, and an unshakable sense of being observed. The whispers were not all malevolent. Some claimed they carried fragments of guidance, directions to avoid structural failures, warnings of imminent breaches, or glimpses of long-lost passages filled with emergency supplies. Others swore they heard prayers answered, faint signs of divine presence in the otherwise mechanical and mortal world. Whether truth or imagination, each whisper shaped the actions of those who listened, guiding footsteps, influencing decisions, and threading caution with inspiration. The fortress, in these moments, became more than stone and steel, it became a threshold between worlds. Above, bombardments raged and fires burned, but below, within the hidden chambers and shadowed halls, perception and reality were malleable, rumor and truth intertwined, and every mind tested by what it could not fully comprehend. And yet, even here, amidst uncertainty and unseen currents, the defenders endured. They adapted. They persisted. They listened to the whispers, even as they questioned whether the voices belonged to the Emperor, the warp, or the fortress itself. The deeper halls seemed to stretch and contract as if breathing, corridors bending subtly in ways that defied logic. Guardsmen moved with caution, their lost guns sweeping the shadows, yet every corner held the possibility of illusion. Adepts paused frequently, recalibrating instruments, annotating surges in energy or temperature that could not be explained by machinery alone. The whispers persisted, low and fragmented, threading between conversations, mingling with the hiss of steam and the clatter of servitors' limbs. "Beware the unseen," one voice muttered in a distant chamber, only to vanish before any verification could occur. Even the most disciplined soldiers felt the unease. Fatigue sharpened perception, heightening suspicion that every shadow might conceal a threat, every flicker of lumens a warning, every vibration in the walls a herald of doom. Yet amidst this tension, a strange clarity emerged, the whispers guided as much as they intimidated. Directions to avoid structural weaknesses, glimpses of hidden stores, and subtle hints of enemy movement came in fleeting moments of insight. It was impossible to know whether these were divine interventions, warp-tinged hallucinations, or simply human intuition amplified by fear, but the information saved lives. Each fragment of guidance, however ephemeral, was a lifeline threaded through the storm of perception. In a chamber dedicated to long-forgotten rituals, the air was thick with incense and ozone. Ancient icons shimmered faintly, their polished surfaces reflecting light in ways that seemed almost intentional. Adepts gathered around, hands hovering over data slates as they recorded anomalies with meticulous care. Some swore that the murals themselves shifted subtly when observed, figures leaning or glancing where no movement existed. "A warning, or a test," whispered one adept. Whether caution, divine intention, or warp trickery, it was impossible to determine. Yet the knowledge that such uncertainties existed demanded vigilance. Ignorance here was dangerous, and hesitation could be fatal. Meanwhile, in the labyrinthine passageways, Skitarii continued their silent patrols. Their mechanical senses detected subtle distortions in energy patterns, fluctuations that could indicate structural stress, enemy presence, or interference from the immaterial currents threading the fortress. They moved with the certainty of clockwork, their glowing eyes piercing shadows that human eyes could not penetrate. Every patrol reinforced the delicate balance between order and chaos, a reminder that even in a citadel shadowed by rumor and unseen forces, discipline and duty remained anchors to reality. A lone guardsman paused in a narrow corridor, eyes narrowing at a flicker of movement along the wall. For a moment, he believed he saw a primarch in bronze armor stride through the shadows, only for the vision to vanish when he blinked. Heart pounding, he whispered a prayer, invoking the Emperor's protection and steadiness. Around him, the fortress remained alive in its own way, every echo, every vibration, every whisper threading together a network of perception and awareness. Even fear became a tool, it honed senses, sharpened instinct, and forced vigilance. Above, the pulse of the Astronomicon remained a distant but steady thrum, threading through the fortress and anchoring perception to something real and tangible. Every whispered rumor, every subtle hallucination, and every shadowed vision existed in contrast to this distant truth, creating a tension between what was observed and what was absolute. Those within the fortress learned to navigate this tension, weighing whispers against duty, fear against logic, intuition against instrument. Survival depended not on certainty, but on the skillful balance of awareness and caution. And yet, even amidst the warp-touched uncertainty, the defenders persisted. They adapted to the labyrinthine corridors, interpreted fleeting visions, and acted upon the guidance the whispers provided. Each step was both deliberate and tentative, a negotiation between perceived threat and observed reality. The fortress itself seemed to encourage this dance, responding to movement, vibration, and thought with subtle shifts, testing the resolve and comprehension of those who walked its hidden halls. By the time the first warning bells of an approaching assault echoed faintly from the outer walls, the defenders were attuned. They had learned to move in concert with shadows, whispers, and glimpses of insight. The warp had not yet claimed them, though its tendrils brushed against perception like cold fingers. Even here, deep within the labyrinth, the fortress and its inhabitants remained resilient. Awareness, discipline, and subtle guidance, real, imagined, or somewhere in between, were tools of survival, sharpening the mind as much as lost gun and armor sharpened the body. The shadows deepened as the night pressed on, yet the fortress remained alive with motion and subtle currents of perception. Every corridor seemed to hum with hidden energy, a vibration imperceptible to most but undeniable to those attuned. Guardsmen moved cautiously, lost guns sweeping the darkness, while adepts recorded shifts in the environment, documenting what they could and leaving room for uncertainty where certainty was impossible. Whispers continued, threading through the halls, now more insistent, more coherent, yet still shrouded in ambiguity. Some spoke of glimpsed figures, neither corporeal nor fully spectral, moving just beyond perception. Scitarii detected anomalies in energy patterns that did not correspond to any machinery or known phenomena. Custodians, stoic and unwavering, observed these shifts with heightened vigilance, their presence a stabilizing counterpoint to the instability in perception. Even those most disciplined felt the edge of unease, the subtle prickle that reminded them that the warp, or something akin to it, was pressing against the edges of reality within the fortress. In one alcove, an adept paused before a mural depicting an ancient siege. His eyes traced the figures of defenders frozen in bronze and stone, noting how the shadows cast by flickering lumens seemed to animate them. A faint whisper seemed to answer his thoughts, a fragment of guidance or warning, impossible to discern with certainty. He recorded it meticulously, annotating with careful disclaimers, possible warp phenomenon, observe and monitor. Yet even in documentation, he felt the pull of doubt, the creeping sense that reality was subtly shifting around him. The whispers were not solely malevolent. Some offered guidance, fragments of information that saved lives or prevented disaster. Hidden passageways revealed themselves, structural weaknesses became apparent before they collapsed, and distant machinery adjusted in ways that suggested intelligence beyond human or mechanical design. Every fragment of insight, whether real or imagined, became a tool for survival, though the cost was constant vigilance and the erosion of certainty. In these halls, knowledge and fear were inseparable, understanding required courage as much as intellect. As patrols moved through corridors that twisted unexpectedly, soldiers and Scitarii became increasingly aware of a shared rhythm, the fortress itself seemed to pulse with awareness. Doors opened slightly before being touched, conduits vibrated in anticipation of flow, and lumens dimmed or brightened almost as if responding to presence. The subtle interplay between perception and reality tested discipline, courage, and faith. Each individual learned to move with both caution and decisiveness, guided by whispers, instinct, and rigorous observation. Even as the outer bombardments intensified, the inner halls maintained their precarious balance. The manufactorums continued their unyielding labor, servitors moved with unerring precision, and the pulse of the Astronomicon threaded faintly through hidden chambers, anchoring minds to the broader galaxy. Yet the whispers persisted, weaving between certainty and ambiguity, threading caution and insight into a tapestry of awareness that became essential to survival. The deeper one moved, the more the whispers shaped action, perception, and understanding. By the time the first assault alarms echoed faintly from the ramparts, the defenders were prepared. They had learned to navigate the labyrinth, interpret the guidance of whispers, and act decisively despite uncertainty. Even in the face of forces beyond perception, they remained resolute. Fear and insight, rumor and observation, doubt and faith, these were tools as vital as armor, lost gun, and hammer. The fortress had become more than stone and steel, it was a crucible of perception, a test of mind, body, and spirit, where the whispers of the warp brushed against reality and forged resilience in those who endured. And so, the citadel waited, alive with unseen currents and conscious in ways impossible to quantify. The defenders, aware of the subtle tug of forces beyond comprehension, adapted, endured, and persisted. The whispers, whether divine, warp-touched, or merely echoes of history, had sharpened minds, tested resolve, and prepared the inhabitants for trials yet to come. For beyond perception, beyond shadow, and beyond the inner labyrinth, the siege continued, and the true test of survival had only just begun. The outer walls trembled under the unrelenting bombardment, yet the fortress endured. Smoke and flame crowned the parapets, casting long shadows over battlements scarred by centuries of war. Guardsmen adjusted their positions, lost guns trained on unseen threats beyond the haze, while custodians moved with measured grace, their golden armor catching every flicker of firelight. Even in chaos, the rhythm of duty persisted, a steady heartbeat beneath the roar of destruction. Within the inner halls, the manufactorums blazed with ceaseless energy, molten promethium flowing through conduits, machinery groaning and hissing as it labored to supply the defenders above. Scitarii patrolled the labyrinthine corridors, eyes glowing faintly, monitoring structural integrity and subtle anomalies. The whispers of the warp lingered in the shadows, teasing perception, threading caution into instinct. The defenders had become attuned, navigating both the physical and the unseen with practiced precision. Survival depended not only on strength or firepower, but on awareness, adaptability, and the ability to act amidst uncertainty. From the ramparts, a sentinel voice called out, reporting incoming formations of orc siege engines, their grotesque silhouettes looming through smoke and fire. The battlements shuddered under the impact of macro-cannons and plasma discharge, yet the defenders held fast. Each salvo was anticipated and countered, bolstered by the unbroken rhythm of labor below, the flow of munitions sustained by the manufactorums and guided by whispers, intuition, and disciplined vigilance. Every individual, every machine, every fragment of doctrine and training worked in concert, a symphony of survival against an unyielding enemy. In a command chamber deep within the fortress, adepts and guardsmen coordinated responses, analyzing reports from sensors, patrols, and the outer walls. Every observation was critical, every movement of the enemy was parsed, annotated, and acted upon with precision. The whispers of the warp provided hints, anomalies offered insight, and human intuition filled gaps that instruments could not measure. Even amidst uncertainty, the defenders' actions were deliberate, informed by a balance of logic, faith, and instinct honed through uncounted trials. On the upper battlements, custodians engaged in relentless combat, their disciplined strikes cutting through waves of orc invaders. The clash of metal, the roar of bolters, and the thunder of artillery formed a harsh cadence, mirrored by the distant hum of manufactorums deep below. Each defender was a node in an intricate network of survival, linking observation, action, and preparation across multiple layers of the fortress. Even as casualties mounted, the rhythm persisted, every fallen warrior was replaced, every gap in defense filled, every moment leveraged to maintain the balance between life and destruction. The deeper halls, where shadows and whispers had tested perception, became vital arteries in the defense. Hidden corridors allowed messengers to move unseen, emergency supplies to reach battlements under fire, and scitarii to reinforce positions where chaos threatened to break lines. Here, the lessons of whispers and perceived anomalies transformed into practical advantage. The warp's touch, subtle though it was, shaped strategy without revealing itself fully, guiding instinct and observation to preserve life and fortify the citadel. Even the relics of past defenders lent their strength. Ancient reliquaries and murals seemed to imbue courage, their presence a quiet reminder that survival was continuity as much as action. Soldiers and adepts drew determination from the awareness that those who had held these halls before had faced equal or greater adversity. The fortress, alive in both material and perception, had become more than a collection of walls and machinery. It was a crucible of resilience, where every sound, shadow, and spark carried meaning. As the first light of a distant sun reflected off scorched battlements, the fortress had endured another night, unbroken. The outer walls remained intact, the manufactorums flowed with unrelenting energy, and the defenders moved with a rhythm forged by fear, duty, and whispers. Victory was not absolute, but survival, in all its precarious glory, had been achieved. And in that endurance, in the persistence of life amidst chaos and uncertainty, the citadel whispered its own truth. Here, in shadow, flame, and steel, the siege unbroken had become more than a state, it was a testament to will, vigilance, and the unyielding spirit of the emperor's servants. The roar of artillery shook the ramparts, yet the defenders moved with calculated precision. Guardsmen adjusted their positions, taking aim at advancing orc formations, while custodians swept through the melee with deadly efficiency, their golden blades slicing through enemy ranks. Every movement was deliberate, a blend of instinct, training, and the subtle guidance drawn from whispers that threaded the fortress like an unseen hand. Even in chaos, the rhythm of survival persisted, a symphony of order within destruction. Below the battlements, the manufactorums continued their relentless labor. Sparks danced across molten promethium, illuminating the faces of adepts and servitors alike. Each strike of hammer, each hiss of valve, was an act of life sustained against overwhelming odds. Scitarii moved with mechanical precision, ensuring that weapons, ammunition, and critical supplies flowed seamlessly to every point of need. The whispering shadows of the warp, once subtle, now seemed to pulse in tandem with the heartbeat of the fortress, guiding, cautioning, and occasionally revealing secrets that turned potential disaster into advantage. A squad of guardsmen moved through an auxiliary corridor, carrying emergency reinforcements to a breach on the eastern wall. The shadows seemed to twist around them, the whispers indistinct yet insistent. One soldier paused, sensing a presence just beyond perception, and instinctively adjusted his path. The subtle guidance saved them from collapsing debris, allowing reinforcements to reach the battlement in time to stabilize the line. In this interplay of uncertainty and action, the fortress itself had become an active participant in its own defense, a living entity guiding those who understood its rhythms. At the center of the fortress, a command chamber buzzed with tense coordination. Adepts analyzed reports, adjusted production schedules, and relayed orders with precision. Every decision was informed by both observation and the intangibles, rumors, intuition, and the whispers that threaded perception like invisible wiring. Even in moments of exhaustion, every action was deliberate, and every outcome depended upon the balance between human judgment and mechanical reliability. The citadel had become a nexus where the tangible and the intangible intertwined, a crucible in which the skill, faith, and courage of its defenders were tested and refined. Outside, the orcs pressed forward with unrelenting ferocity. Their crude engines of war rumbled against stone and steel, yet each assault was met with coordinated resistance. Bolter fire cracked in deadly arcs, lost guns scorched metal and flesh alike, and custodians moved like golden phantoms, cutting through the tide with unwavering precision. Every defender, from the lowest-ranking guardsman to the highest custodian, was linked in purpose and awareness, each action reinforcing the next, each sacrifice contributing to the larger arc of survival. Even in the heart of conflict, moments of awe and reflection persisted. Soldiers glimpsed distant banners of the fortress, scorched but unbroken, and found renewed resolve in the knowledge that the walls themselves had endured countless sieges. The manufactorums continued to burn, providing the lifeblood of munitions and supplies, while whispers in hidden corridors offered hints of danger and opportunity. The warp's touch, subtle and insidious, had been transformed from source of fear into instrument of survival, a reminder that awareness, courage, and faith were as potent as any weapon. As twilight descended, the final waves of the assault began to ebb. The fortress had held, its battlements scarred but intact, its manufactorums humming with unbroken rhythm, and its defenders standing resolute. Even as fires licked at the walls and smoke obscured the distant horizon, the siege unbroken remained a reality, testament not only to the strength of stone and steel, but to the indomitable will of those who inhabited it. Every whisper heeded, every shadow navigated, every decision made in uncertainty had coalesced into survival. And in the quiet moments between bombardments, when the smoke hung thick and the distant echoes of war faded to a low murmur, the citadel seemed to exhale. Its pulse, steady and unbroken, resonated with those who had endured the night, a silent acknowledgement of courage, sacrifice, and vigilance. The fortress, alive in stone, flame, and perception, had proven that survival was possible even against overwhelming odds. Here, in the fires of the forge, the shadows of the warp, and the unyielding courage of the Emperor's servants, the siege unbroken was complete, at least for now. The first light of dawn broke through the smoke-streaked sky, casting the fortress in pale gold and crimson. Outside, the battlefield was littered with the remnants of orc engines, scorched earth, and the shattered remains of attackers who had dared breach the walls. Within, the survivors moved through corridors scarred by fire and battle, their armor dented, clothing torn, and faces etched with exhaustion. Yet their eyes held resolve. They had endured. They had survived. The fortress had not fallen. In the manufactorums, the fires still burned, molten promethium flowing through conduits like veins sustaining life itself. Adepts moved among the machinery, checking valves, guiding servitors, and cataloging damage. Scitarii patrolled tirelessly, their glowing optics sweeping for residual dangers, while custodians maintained their silent vigil, ensuring that every critical point remained secure. The rhythm of labor and survival continued, a testament to discipline, duty, and unbroken determination. Even amidst ruins and exhaustion, life persisted. The whispers of the warp, which had haunted hidden corridors and shadowed halls, were now quieter, fading to the edges of perception. Yet their influence remained, subtly shaping decisions, guiding movements, and preserving the lives of those who had listened carefully. Soldiers and adepts alike reflected on moments when perception had blurred with rumor, when intuition had saved a comrade, and when the unseen had whispered warnings that turned disaster into survival. These experiences had become part of the fortress, interwoven into its very essence, a reminder that victory was not merely physical, but also mental and spiritual. Outside the inner walls, custodians and guardsmen swept the ramparts, surveying the battlefield. They moved methodically, clearing debris, recovering weapons, and tending to the wounded. Every motion was precise, every decision deliberate, reinforcing the fortress's resilience. The siege had tested not only strength and armament, but the endurance of mind, body, and faith. Each soldier, every scitarii, every adept had contributed to an intricate symphony of survival, where timing, perception, and courage were as decisive as firepower. In quieter chambers, adepts recorded observations, cataloging the events of the siege for future generations. They noted the anomalies, the whispers, the glimpses of what may have been warp influence, and the acts of courage that had turned potential catastrophe into endurance. These records would serve as both warning and guidance, a legacy for those who would one day walk these halls when darkness returned. The fortress had survived this night, but the galaxy remained vast and hostile, a constant crucible for those who dwelt within its walls. Above, the Astronomicon pulsed faintly, threading its distant light through the fabric of the Imperium and anchoring perception to the Emperor's will. Every survivor, every observer, felt that distant presence as both reassurance and mandate. The fortress endured because its inhabitants were vigilant, disciplined, and unwavering in their devotion. Even amidst ruin and fatigue, there was purpose. Even amidst whispers and uncertainty, there was guidance. Even amidst chaos and fire, there was order. And so, as the smoke drifted away and the fires of the manufactorums cooled only slightly, the fortress stood unbroken. The siege had tested everything, strength, skill, courage, perception, and faith, but it had not conquered the defenders. They had adapted, survived, and emerged with the pulse of the citadel intact. Every corridor, every hall, every shadowed chamber had contributed to this victory, weaving a tapestry of resilience that was both tangible and intangible, mechanical and spiritual. In the silent aftermath, the fortress itself seemed to breathe, its walls settling, its machinery humming, its pulse steady. The siege unbroken was not merely a record of defense, but a living testament to perseverance, awareness, and the indomitable spirit of the Emperor's servants. Within these walls, amid fire, metal, shadow, and whisper, life endured. The citadel had survived, and in doing so, had proven that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there was strength, resilience, and unwavering resolve.